We'll start with a brief introduction of our speakers for today, and then we'll have a deep dive into a couple of the new capabilities within Akamai. First, we'll cover the Onboard and Configuration Assistant. For anybody who's been with Akamai for a while, you might remember how difficult it is in getting started with routing a site onto the Akamai platform. That process has been greatly simplified, and now with the Onboard and Configuration Assistant, we'll show you how you can have a new property configured within just a few minutes. In fact, we'll even be setting up a test property during today's webinar. Next, we'll turn to security and cover how Akamai's new API protection capabilities within Kona Site Defender are being leveraged. More and more organizations are now using APIs to drive their online presence as well as their various digital channels, and as a result, securing these interfaces has sometimes become an important aspect for us to look at, and that's part of what we're doing with the Kona Site Defender suite. We'll cover how we're doing that and more in just a few minutes. Today's speakers are Daniel Shagru and Allison Peacock. Daniel Shagru is a Director of Product Marketing at Akamai. He has 15 years of experience working in telecom and the security industry. Prior to working at Akamai, he was the Principal Product Marketing Manager for RSA. He now drives the marketing activities for Akamai's web security solutions, which provide cloud-based website protection services for many of the world's largest companies. But kicking us off this afternoon is Allison Peacock. Allison is the Director of Product Management at Akamai. Her focus is on the Akamai user portal known as Luna. She has over 18 years of development and her product experience, as well as a great deal of experience in the enterprise market. Allison, good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone. So today I'm going to be telling you about a new tool that we're about to introduce called the Onboard and Configuration Assistant. I will provide an overview, then I will show you a quick demo of the application that describes the interface and the workflow, and then we'll wrap up with how you can access the tool and when it will be generally available to you. Now, today's theme is getting up and running quickly, and as Rob alluded to, one of the most consistent pieces of feedback that we get from Akamai customers is that it can take some time and effort to onboard. By onboard, I mean the steps taken after you become an Akamai customer to begin using the service. So this includes gaining credentials to the user portal, to the Luna Control Center, to interacting with Akamai professionals to describe the site that you want to bring onto the Akamai network, to learning about and taking advantage of all the features that Akamai products and services have to offer, and knowing which are beneficial to your particular situation so you can optimize things like performance and security or offload to meet your needs. Now, as you know, Akamai has a very robust toolkit with lots of levers that offer lots of flexibility, but you have to have the time to invest to learn to use them or the money to spend to pay Akamai to apply our best practices. And what's been missing is a way to configure service yourself without needing to engage Akamai professionals and in a way that doesn't require you to have a degree in CDNs. The Onboard Configuration Assistant, or OCA, comes in. So OCA is Akamai's 4-step self-provisioning tool, and it delivers a highly customized, complete configuration as a result of a simple workflow that skips all the Akamai jargon and presents clear and simple steps. This tool requires no prior knowledge of CDNs or of Akamai, and has what we call a unified interface. That means all the steps can be completed within the application. So you don't need to navigate through Luna Control Center to find the right tool for the next step. The workflow guides the user and has ample descriptions and help built in along the way. The system automates behind the scenes many of the steps of our traditional provisioning workflow, and it allows progress through the workflow to be made very quickly. The last point is that all configurations are run through our recommendation engine, which applies Akamai best practices to the configuration, and that's based on the information that's provided by the user in the interface, and also based on a site analysis that OCA performs in the background. So the result is a highly customized, complete configuration with a seat time of about 15 minutes. So let me say a few things about that statement. First, the configuration produced by OCA is not merely a default config. You won't hear us refer to it that way because it's not one size fits all. It's customized. This is a meaningful configuration that's meant to endure and provide value for some time. You could theoretically set it and forget it. Secondly, the 15-minute seat time is an approximation for the time it takes to click through the 4 steps of the workflow. It doesn't account for the time it takes for tasks that the user needs to complete, like updating the DNS config or applying for a third-party certificate. Sometimes these take time or need approvals, and we've accounted for those tasks in the workflow, but the seat time is the time that you are interacting with the OCA interface. So now, let's watch a demo where I walk through each step of the workflow. And after the demo, I'll talk about how we follow up with recommendations after the configuration is live on the Akamai network.
So here we are in Luna Control Center, and this is the Onboard and Configuration Assistant interface. Here it has 4 steps. So here we are in Luna Control Center, and this is the Onboard and Configuration Assistant interface. Here it has 4 steps, starting with site requirements, configuration settings, preview and test, and go live. We'll step through each one. So first with site requirements, this is a guided set of questions to gather data about the site that you want to bring on board to Akamai. Each question has a description as well as the opportunity to learn more, get more information about the question and why we're asking. So let's get started. The first question asks us which product we want to use to onboard the domain. So in this case, there are multiple products that are enabled for OCA. So we get to choose which one we want to use, and I'm going to choose Ion Standard. There's also a choice for the contract, but I'm going to leave the default contract in place. The next question asks about the domain and any aliases. So here's the domain that we want to onboard. This is the host name or the URL. And the alias refers to an alternate name for the domain that points to the same origin server and serves the same content. So one domain at a time. And I'm going to use example.com. Next, we're asked what we primarily serve on this domain. So I'm going to choose website. This will help OCA to set the proper cache and compression settings. The next few questions deal with security and secure traffic. So question number 4 asks about whether we handle PCI type information or PCI compliance on this site. So if you are processing online payments, it's important to maintain the payment card industry data security standards. And so you would choose yes here. And what that would indicate to us, to Akamai, to OCA, is that we would need to set up the network in order to meet their required encryption standards and then serve secure site traffic through HTTPS. However, I'm going to choose no for the demo. The next question asks about whether the site contains personal information, you know, private customer data, that kind of thing. If it did, you would choose yes, but I'm going to choose no. And then lastly, do you, for other reasons, require to serve secure traffic through HTTPS on this site? If you chose yes of any of these questions 4 or 5, then you would choose yes here, but I'm going to choose no. And that's it. Now we're ready to move on to the next step. So now what's happening is the system is performing a site analysis, and it's automatically applying best practices to the configuration settings. It's creating the cache settings based on the assets on the site and turning on other key features to help the site perform better. So one note before we move on. If you needed to step away from the workflow for any reason, click the exit button, and the workflow will save your progress so that you can pick up where you left off when you return. So here we are in step 2, configuration settings. The site analysis has been completed, And now the OCA interface is showing me tasks that I need to complete in order to go live with the complete configuration. So that's indicated to me here in a list of to-do items. I have one to-do item here. There is a larger list of all settings, which are all of the choices that I could make. Most of them OCA is making on my behalf, but it still does need a little bit of information from me, and that's why I have this to-do item here. So what I need to do is set up the DNS record for the origin host name. And it provides me a link to do this and a workflow that walks me through the step. The information is pre-populated for me. I just have to hit check. And I can see now that my origin host name resolved and my to-do item is now removed. So I am ready at this point to continue on to preview and test. At this point, my site is being configured automatically. In the past, this is where I would have spent a lot of time in parts of the portal. But OCA is taking care of creating the CP codes, the edge host names, and the configuration. Everything is completed within this application in place here. And now we're ready to test. To test the site, we need to make sure that the domain that we're onboarding renders on Akamai's network. For that test, all I need to do is click this link, and that will open a new tab or a new window that shows the site rendering on Akamai's network. But because this is a demo and this is not a real site, if I click this, it's not going to work. Additionally, you can test your site's functionality to make sure that the site works correctly on the Akamai network. And there are step-by-step instructions here for how to spoof test the domain. I am done testing, so I am going to continue to go live. So here we are in the last step of our workflow, the go live step. And what we need to do here is make the change to the DNS configuration. So for each domain, we need to replace the existing A record with a CNAME record that directs traffic to this specified Akamai site. Once we've made the change, then we will verify the DNS settings by clicking this button. So let's pretend that we've done that. We'll click the button. And behind the scenes, we're performing a DNS lookup to verify that the CNAME was created accurately. So then we get our success, and then we're finished. And now our site is onboarded to Akamai. And the configuration is completely customized to the site. And what used to take hours, maybe days to complete, is now accomplished in a few minutes in 4 easy steps, all in one application, right here with Onboard and Configuration Assistant. Once the configuration is live, you can view the property details and the performance summary here on the property landing page. You'll be able to do a few things here. You can set notifications and alerts. You can purge cached content. You can open a support case. And you can also view the configuration in Property Manager, or you could convert the configuration to a Property Manager property. So let me say a few words about that. If you're familiar with Property Manager, you know that it's a very robust configuration tool. There are lots of features, lots of modules, lots of settings there. OCA has only a subset of what's available in Property Manager. If you want to take advantage of what's in Property Manager, you can convert your OCA configuration file into a Property Manager property. However, this is a one-way conversion and it cannot be reversed. So be mindful and only convert to Property Manager if you're sure that you want to stay there. If you do want to stay in OCA, you can still manage your configuration file here. You would go from this page to Edit Configuration, and that would keep you within the Onboarding Configuration Assistant application. It would take you back to the Configuration Settings page, where you can then manage the settings that are here for your particular configuration. then be able to save your choices, go back through preview and test, and then push those changes back out to the network. And that's the end of the demo.
So that seems pretty easy, right? Even with the demonstration and my voiceover, it took about 9 minutes to get through the workflow. Now remember when I said that you could set and forget the configuration if you wanted to? Well, you could, but I hope you don't. We would like to encourage you to evolve configurations over time because things change, and OCA will help you do this. After the initial config is live for about a week, we're going to send you an email. And that email is going to have some recommendations for things that you can tweak to improve or to optimize things like performance, security, or offload. And these recommendations are based on real traffic patterns and use our recommendations engine so that you don't have to miss out on Akamai expertise just because you're using a self-service tool. And it looks something like this on the screen. What the email will tell you is an outline of what we recommend, why we are recommending the change, what benefit we feel it brings to the configuration and to your business, and the steps to take to implement. You will continue to receive these email recommendations monthly by default, or you can change the frequency or opt out of them entirely. So let's reflect on what we've just seen. The goal of the Onboarding and Configuration Assistant is to provide a guided, faster, easier experience for onboarding to Akamai. And once we're onboarded, Akamai monitors the configuration and sends you recommendations for optimizing that configuration. Sounds pretty good, I hope. So let's talk about how you can access it. So right now, OCA is currently in limited availability. But if you are interested, if you think that this is something that you could benefit from, you can speak with your account manager, or you can send us an email at this email address, and we'll speak to you about participating in our LA. We are on track to go GA next month, and when we do, you'll be able to see a link for OCA on the Luna Control Center homepage if you have one of the supported products. And the supported product line right now is the ION product line, and this also includes RMA, DSD, and DSA. And we have a roadmap for additional product support later this year, and we're hoping to give you an update if you are coming to our customer conference, our EDGE conference in October. So that is the end of my presentation, and now I am going to hand it over to Dan Shagru to build on our theme and speak about using Kona Site Defender to protect the API.
All right, thanks very much, Allison. So yeah, I'm going to show a little bit more of the interface here in just a minute and continue with the theme of using the interface to enhance your site and, in my case, protect your site, and in particular, protect your APIs. Before I get into that, though, I want to do just a quick review. You know, when we talk about an application programming interface or an API, what are we talking about? Well, first of all, an API is a contract between two systems that are communicating over the internet, right? That's simple enough. Traditionally, websites have brokered the conversation between an end user and the back-end infrastructure. And APIs are, in some ways, in some cases, supplanting that or offering another way to broker conversations between multiple entities. They enable applications to access data and services within your enterprise, and they also integrate with the same infrastructure that your website is using. So you might have, just as an example, let's call it a retailer that's selling widgets online. We'll get creative and call it XYZ Widget Corporation. And let's assume that the retailer wants its customers to be able to order the widget both through mobile apps, and they want to also be able to see their order history through the mobile app. So the mobile app would likely communicate back to the retailer's infrastructure using an API. And just as an aside, many times when people talk about APIs, they talk about mobile apps. Mobile apps aren't the only users of APIs, although they are the biggest users of APIs. Another example would be weather info that you typically see on your desktop or on your Outlook, and that data is almost always pulled into that infrastructure through an API. So APIs are everywhere. Just on the Akamai platform, we see that 4% of our properties today are offering some sort of API, but that 4% is representing 25% of the traffic that we're seeing. And if you look at just the web performance traffic, in other words, you take out things like streaming and downloads, the number rises to more like 50% of traffic. So APIs are a big deal, and as those of us in the security world know, where the traffic goes, so go the attackers or the hackers or the chaotic actors, if you will. We're seeing that APIs, on the one hand, they're providing granular access and transparency to your infrastructure. On the other hand, we're seeing that without proper protection, doing that creates security risks. And it's a misconception, by the way, that the APIs are safe because they'll only be used by your quote-unquote authorized apps. The truth is, and in reality, what we see is that APIs outside of these apps are being exploited, and hackers, chaotic actors are finding weaknesses in your back-end infrastructure through these APIs. So if you think about there being two doors into your infrastructures, website and APIs, attackers, as you know, have long looked at the websites and attacked them, but now these days they're looking at the APIs to attack them, and that is a relatively simple illustration of the fact that the APIs are vulnerable. So last bit before we get into the demo here, API protection capabilities in the March release of Kona Site Defender. They include protections that inspect the parameters of modern RESTful APIs, and that includes JSON body and path parameters. The API protections allow you to predefine what you allow in. This is, in other words, there's a form of positive security model here. And Kona Site Defender will allow you to use rate controls to mitigate DDoS attacks via API. And finally, we've added analytics and reporting at the API level into the latest release of Kona Site Defender. So basically, you can think of the protections for APIs in Kona Site Defender as the same as the protections that you've been enjoying for your website. That's if you're already a customer of Kona Site Defender or KSD, or you can think of API protections as those that you get for both your APIs and your website if you become a new customer of Kona Site Defender. All right, so enough with the preamble. Let's actually look at what this all looks like, or basically how you would apply protections to your APIs once you've defined them for your site and you're in the Kona Site Defender interface. So in this particular case, let's come back to our customer. It's XYZ Widget Corporation, and we want to use Kona Site Defender to protect them. So this is, let's take a look at the interface here. We're talking about, let's get this started, fired up. Okay, so XYZ Widget Corporation sells widgets online. In other words, they're an e-commerce company. They've determined that they want to enhance their mobile widget shopping experience, and they want to use a single set of APIs in the back end to communicate with the front end of both the website and the mobile apps. Okay? And let's further assume that XYZ Widgets is pretty modern and fashionable when it comes to the latest technology. Therefore, they want to use RESTful APIs, and not only that, they prefer not to use XML, but rather to use JSON as the data communication format. So their APIs are written, and now they want to protect them. Okay, so we're into Security Monitor, and there's basically three steps for protecting an API. The first step is to register the API that you want to protect. So we're going to go to the configuration menu, click on and look for the new app called Manage API Definitions. Click on that, and then you'll see the list of APIs that have been defined for this particular account. Each API, if we scroll down, is represented with an index card-like layout. Here you're seeing a summary of the API, the URL, the description over on the right, and then to the right of that you're seeing the resources that are protected under that API. And then if you, let's see, if we can scroll up, basically what we'll see up top, if we click on API security, we'll see the firewall policy, the protection measures within that particular policy, and then attack activity within the last 7 days. We've also introduced the concept of API categories to help our customers organize APIs, if they choose, into particular categories. So you see here cloud security, media delivery. Any API can belong to one or more categories, and it can also just simply be uncategorized. All right, so let's start by defining an API. So we're going to go over to the orange button up at the top here. We get over, define new API. And in order to define the API, you're basically looking at three different choices. You can define the API manually, so we'll type in a name here, call it API for shopping, or actually better, let's call it shopping API, so a little more of a ring to it. Once you do that, you'll give it the host name and the base path. Again, this would be manually, the first way you can do this. And then you could specify the location of the API key, and then optionally give categories or descriptions of the API. You can also define resources for a particular API. But you might, and there's an easier way to do this, you might import your API details. So you can see the import field here. Let's click on yes. And then we'll choose either Swagger or the RAML format. Swagger seems to be more popular. Click on File, choose the file. Hope that I loaded my desktop already. Yes, there's the JSON file. And then click Import, and you'll see all of the fields automatically filled in because I've got a nice organized Swagger definition for my API. Once you go in, you can see the host name pre-populated now, the base path, the location of the key, even a brief description of the API. And you can also see individual resources defined under this particular API endpoint. So if I scroll down, you see there's API resources. And I'm going to go a little bit, there's a few of these, so I want to find one that's particularly interesting. Let's look at the customer address resource. There we go, customer address, and we can see two methods have been defined for this. So this resource has a name. It's identified by a path. It's the URL for that resource. And under this particular resource, there are two methods supported. And I've been able to define individual parameters under that resource. So let's click on Post, and then you can see here this is a JSON object, and also that we've been able to define individual elements within the JSON object, and then define whether or not any of these parameters are required or not. So there are a couple of ways here where we can define a positive security model. One is at the bottom, sort of middle right, you can see where you can specify the length, min and max here. And then the other, if I scroll way back up, oops, gotta get off of required. Yeah, no, it's the wrong way. Let me come up. There we go. I can see request body constraints, which essentially is another way of saying, let's provide a positive security model for this API. Here I can specify the max body size, the max nesting depth, let's say 2, And basically, if a request comes in that's outside of these parameters or constraints, it'll be flagged as potentially malicious. I just saved it before I actually said yes, that I do want to apply positive security. So I'm going back, clicking yes, and now I'm going to click Save My API. So basically, I'm defining a whitelist of expected values for my API in this case. Now, I've got the API defined, and I can save it and go to security configuration. So let's look at security configuration. Now you'll see a note here that the API endpoint has already been used. That's because I was good and practiced a couple times before I came in here, so this particular API has already been created. But I want to go to configure and then security configurations. Ignore that. That's, again, just a function of the fact that I was in here twice creating this. I'm going to look for a non-production version of the configuration file. And then I want to add a rate policy. And note that in this case, you see matched targets for APIs just as you do for websites. So we're treating the APIs, in other words, as quote-unquote first-class citizens with the same protections that we give to websites. And remember, for any newbies out there, matched targets define what we want to protect, and the firewall policies define how we want to protect it. Okay? So you can see that an API policy already exists, and we did this for the purposes of the demonstration. It's sort of like having the cake already baked in the oven. In real life, you define the firewall policy to protect the API yourself, and you do that either by cloning an existing firewall policy and adding API protections to it, or by creating a greenfield policy. And you typically only create one firewall policy to protect all of your APIs, provided that your APIs are logically related. Okay, so let's see. I want to add a matched, I'm adding the matched target API, so choosing the shopping API here. I want to select the policy name. We've used a very easy name here. If I go down to Edge and click on that, I can select API policy. You'll note that by default, I get the positive security, or AKA request constraints. I'll save that, and now you can see the API policy, or the second one, added to my match target. And now, I'm going to want to add, I'm going to want to add a firewall policy, or actually a rate control. Hold on a second here. Oh, yes. You can see that we have application layer controls. Before we move on, we have network layer controls, rate controls, reputation controls, slow post protections, and API request constraints. Those features all already existed for websites. We've extended them to APIs, with the exception of API request constraints, which was added specifically for APIs, as well as we've extended the rate controls from websites to APIs as well. Okay, so you can see, let's see, we want to go back up now. And enhance, we want to use the client IP for the, let's see, let me just scroll up. Basically what we need to do now is we need to add rate controls for the API policy that we just added. So what I need to do, I believe, is scroll up. That's down. Working backwards here. Here we go. Rate category management. Again, select my API test policy. Select edit. Now we can see this is the rate control for the shopping API. You can do the rate category type. This all looks fine. We're going to want to look at the available APIs on the left-hand side of the screen and add those to the selected APIs, and then select that, in this case the shopping API. And here you can see that we could actually deselect some of the resources for the API if we didn't want a particular resource to be rate controlled. Okay, so we have that level of granularity here. Click on Save. And now we want to define what the rate controls are. So again, we're coming back in. We want to look for our configuration versions. Click on something that's relatively new and inactive. And now we can see rate policies and firewall policies. So finally, we get to actually define the rate categories. So we click on the plus. Oops, that's not that. Give me 1 second. So I just clicked on New Firewall Policy. And as I spoke to you before, this is something that you could do for a whole group of APIs or for a particular API. But in this case, I actually meant to click on Rate Policies. So let's go back. Just click. Oops. All the way up to the back button. And we'll get to, if we go, this is something you might do if you were doing a firewall policy, but I think what we want to do here is actually go back. Ignore this. Yep. And then I think we can find over here rate policies instead of firewall policies. Click the plus next to rate policies. Over there, cursor. Perfect. And then once we've done that, we can take a look at rate category management. So the first change that you'll see is that you can do rate controls at the API level. So here's the list of APIs that we just defined. API test. You can select the API for which you want to apply the rate control, and then you can do rate controls at that level. And you can also zoom in on the resource level. So you want to, you could say, for instance, for this one that you want a burst threshold of 5, average threshold of 10. Click Save. And in this case, I'm going to do just that. And we've basically now defined how we want to protect the API, and so that we can push the security configuration into staging and ultimately into the production network. So the last step here is actually just going to be to look at Security Monitor. So in here we can see we basically do incident response and false positive tuning. So in this particular case, we're looking at some activity that happened around 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time last night, and a little bit more activity that happened around 5 p.m. The night before. Below that, you can see where these potential attacks came from. In terms of, you can look at stats by country. It looks like most of the attacks came, you just saw it refreshed there, came from the USA, from Bulgaria. We could actually choose to sort by the mitigated attacks and see if there's any difference there between what's detected and what's mitigated. And it looks like indeed there is. So in this case, USA is still far, far ahead as far as the source of attacks. Russian Federation a distant second now instead of Bulgaria in terms of mitigated attacks. Now you could sort by the API ID or the API key. You could also, on the right here, look at the rule ID, and if we scroll down, we'll see some of our whitelisted rules have been triggered. So in one case, there's an API parameter missing, and then in another case, there's a parameter outside of the minimum constraints. So a couple of instances here where requests came in that triggered our positive security model. The other thing that we've done here is we've introduced 2 new reports, and this is for both web and API activity, and it's both for application security and DDoS activity. So I'm going to click over here to show you the application security activity, because both of the reports follow the same structure. The useful thing about this report is that you can segment traffic based on the website or the API. You can go back in time up to 90 days. You can filter based on the firewall policy or the API name, and you can see the type of attack that's detected. So the APIs that were subject to attack and the host names. So we're seeing here AppSec attack traffic trends. Scrolling down, we'll see AppSec attack types detected, where they were detected. And if we continue to scroll down, we'll see the firewall policies that were triggered by the AppSec attacks. And then finally, at the very bottom is the host names, but right here we're going to look at the APIs targeted by the AppSec attacks. So there's the content API, the user profile API, logging API, etc. So a little bit more in here than we created in the demo, just to show you the breadth of what you can get. So these two reports essentially provide not only value confirmation, but also give you high-level visibility into attacks themselves. Now, with that, hopefully you got a sense for the breadth and the granularity that is available to you with the March release of Corner Site Defender in terms of protecting APIs, and also kind of a little bit of a taste for how much control you have over how to protect those APIs. And hopefully it wasn't completely overwhelming, but it seemed like it was a manageable process to protect those APIs within the security monitor and security configuration interfaces that are in turn within Luna. So with that, I want to hand over back to Rob, see if we had any questions come up while we were presenting. And Allison and I can try to answer those as best we can.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Once again, if you have questions for our speakers today, we'd love to hear from you. Just use the Q&A window to submit a question. If you don't see the Q&A window, look at the menu bar at the bottom of the webinar screen and click the Q&A button. Let's go ahead and start with you, Dan. Over the couple of questions that have come in so far, it makes sense that protecting APIs is important, but I wonder, why don't I see anything from OWASP on protecting APIs?
Okay, so that's a good question. Rumor has it that OWASP is actually in the process of debating adding API protections to the top 10. At Akamai, we certainly see a lot of activity from chaotic actors targeting APIs, so we're hoping that OWASP will include these in the future. But it's true, they're not there now, and hopefully the next rev or sort of update of the OWASP top 10, well, I shouldn't say hopefully. If it is true outside of Akamai that this is also the case, others are seeing APIs be protected, we're hoping that the OWASP organization will bring visibility into that.
All right, let's keep going with a couple more questions for Dan. I write my own API to only accept traffic from authorized apps. Is it necessary to provide protections beyond just authentication?
Writing the APIs to accept only traffic from authorized apps is good practice and best practice. However, in our experience, we haven't seen that that's enough. In other words, there are ways to spoof applications and to get past the authentication controls to exploit the APIs on the back end.
Okay. And do your APIs include any positive modeling?
So absolutely, yes, they do, and we're very proud of that fact. I tried to make loud mention of that at a couple different points in the demo. Yes, we allow our customers to define the parameters that they would expect an API call to be within when they make that call. And anything outside of that, we can flag or deny as being malicious.
Okay. And for Allison, going back to OCA, for a secure configuration, what type of certificates are supported?
Yeah, good question. So DV and OV certs can be provisioned right in OCA in the interface, so you don't need to go to CPS, which is typically how you would do it. You don't need to go to CPS separately for DV and OV certs. Third-party certs and EV certs do require you to use CPS to provision them, but they can be selected in the OCA workflow by choosing an existing certificate while going through the provisioning workflow. And one thing that I want to note, too, is that I didn't mention this in the demo, is that if you're waiting on a cert, because often they take time, and you don't have a live certificate on Akamai's network, OCA will still allow you to test the domain using Akamai's test certificate. And then when you have the actual certificate live on the Akamai network, OCA will take you back through the preview and test and go live so that you can retest using the actual certificate.
So here's a question that looks to be coming from somebody who's probably already got some experience in here. Is there an option to manage existing accounts or existing properties with OCA?
That is a good question and an important point. So as a customer of Akamai, you can use OCA. However, OCA is currently only supported for new properties, so ones that have not previously been brought onto the Akamai network. So I know many customers have sites that they want to bring on board but haven't for some reason. So I would say speak to your account rep and see if OCA is right for those sites, and it could be a really quick and easy way to get them up and running.